Alright boys, here we go. So, new tutorial, in HD this time, thank you to whoever commented on it last time. Anyway, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about values and how to approach learning them. So, while I try to put together some abstract shape to work on, I'm going to go over the thought processes you want to have, things you want to think about, and workflow, because especially when doing values digitally, workflow is the most important thing. It's also important when working traditionally, but a little bit less so. Actually, I think it might be more so. Either way, the point is that unlike sketching, where you're trying to find ideas, you're trying to generate concepts. When you're doing your values, you want to make sure that you have some sort of workflow that lets you approach things in a logical fashion. There's lots of different ways to do it, but I'm going to talk about two basic ones and the tools required to work at them. Those are dark to light and light to dark. Because at the end of the day, when you're laying down your values, this will work, you want to be able to describe the form. That's what all mark making is. I talked about this in the last video, but I'll talk about it again briefly here. We're making 2D marks on a 2D surface to try to represent 3D form. And so when you're doing that, you have a couple of different tools. When you're working with line, things like line weight can give you a hint at it. And when you're working with value and edges pull all the work. So what this means in practical terms, and what you can take away from this is the one thing you want to write down, is as a beginner, you need to focus on getting the right values. Ignore edges completely. As a result, some people will tell you to only use a hard round brush. Personally, I'm not a fan of that. I think that it's way more difficult, but it depends on the software, and this is largely why I use Paint Tool SAI. Anyway, all that really means is that you need, just like we talked about the basic mark making techniques in the last episode, you need to be able to get the value that you want and adjust it when you don't get the value that you want, because that's going to happen. You're going to mark down the wrong value, and it's going to be a problem. So, and this is why working, in my opinion, from light to dark is difficult, because it's really fucking hard to check to see if that value is right. What's going to end up happening is you're going to put yourself in a situation where you'll choose a shadow value, probably at random, you'll put it down, and it'll look fine until you start putting in the rest of the values, and then all of a sudden it will look wrong and you won't know why, and you'll have to work from scratch to try to figure that out. So, when I'm approaching it, I like to work from light to dark, from dark to light, and I like to use soft brushes, and here's why. For starters, this is pretty standard stuff. Line art in its own layer on multiply, values underneath, and then merge them down to clean them up. When you're working from dark to light, one, it helps you preserve your darks, because as a beginner, this happens with everybody, they're too afraid to go as dark as they need to, and the darks help things read. Actually, I'll wait on this for a moment. Yeah. So, if you start working from dark to light, you don't have to worry about your shadows being not being dark enough. See, this doesn't look that dark, especially compared to this like black of the lines that I'm using. But if you look over here at my color wheel, right? This is black that I have selected now. This is my background color. I still have all of this space. I have white, I have in between that, I have that, and I'm still not at my actual, I'm still not at my actual base color. So as a result, I find it helps preserve shadows if you do this like that. So if you function from dark to light, it makes it much easier to preserve your shadows, which in the end is what tells the form of the object you're working with. So when I'm approaching a form study, I'll pick a nice dark value, not black. Black is reserved for occlusion, but you can go as dark as you like without hitting black, because if you hit black you won't be able to see your lines and it's just too dark. But this is a nice dark value. You see, there's still this huge jump between these two values, but as far as actual numerical difference, it's only about 30. So this is jumping from 100% black to about 30% black, or I guess that would be 70% black, depending on which way you're counting from. But in size, it counts from 0 to 255. So yeah, it would be about 30%. So once you have your background color, and this is what matters, I like to choose something most of the way up there to keep them separate. You're going to have highlights somewhere most of the time. But because they're highlights, you want something in the middle. So we've got here, all the way up at white in this corner, and we've got our gray. And I like to stay closer to the grays, or closer to my shadow values, so that way the whites pop. Pretty sure that makes sense. So this here is the light color I'm going to be working with, and then you'll be able to make it pop really easily with pure white. And see how this looks lighter here than here? That's because of the relativity of values. And that's why working from dark to light is easier, because then you don't really have to worry about visually matching up the relative values. You just have to work off of your logical plan of, this is my light shape, this is my dark shape, and never the twain shall meet. So, as far as workflow goes, I like to use a soft brush to lay in my values, because I think it makes it easier to get an idea of the shapes. Right, so you do something like this, where you just sort of brush them in, very loose, very fuzzy, and now, like, if you squint, the values work. Is there a way I can blur this? Not really. But, like, if I zoom out, that reads. You can see that this top part here is a sphere that has some form shadows, that is to say shadows that are created by facing away from the light. And there's a cast shadow, that is to say a shadow that's created by an object being between the surface and the light. And with those two things, you basically have all the information that you need, and the rest from here is rendering. And I'll do the same thing with this one, and I'll give it light from the same direction. So we'll quickly mark in what I would consider to be a plane that's facing the light, so that would be these. And the thing is that the soft brush sort of helps naturally create form shadows that you can finagle the way you need them later. So they start out very loose and very gestural, and then you tighten them up as you go. But if you start out light, you can get that clean, big picture read much easier. And in this case here, for example, I decided that this section of the image doesn't have enough form to it, so I'll go in at a little bit there, do some finagling. And now it sort of reads how they're catching the light on an abstract level. After that, the rest is rendering. And this is why working with simple value structures is easier. Because this part, getting this to read, is the hardest part for beginners. I have an example here of one that was done earlier by somebody that I know. There's simultaneously too many values and not enough values going on. And what I mean by that is, watch my color picker up here. This, like everything in this section here is roughly the same value. Then all of a sudden it plunges down. Check, eyes on the color picker. It plunges down really far here and here. But the thing is that both of these, both this point and this point, are in shadow. And as a result, they're on the same object with presumably the same texture. They should be the same value. I did a quick little recreation over here where you can see that while they're not identical, they're much more similar than this. See the jump versus the jump here? And by working from dark to light, whoops, I had some other stuff in the shot now. But by working from dark to light, you can preserve that distinctness between the values. And if you see here, without the lines, they don't read nearly as well. And you can take care of that later once your value map is in place. And this didn't require a lot of thinking or planning. It was as simple as, like, it was not a big to small algorithm. It was a it was a very binary choice tree. I get to a point, I think, is this facing the light or not? If yes, I make a mark. If no, I don't. Fairly simple stuff. That is doing a value study. Taking this into rendering is where mastery of the tools comes into play, and you can use whatever method you want, but it's generally as simple as making the stuff that needs to be hard, hard, and the stuff that needs to be soft, soft. So once you have your map in place, I like to save a copy of my line art layer, and then combine everything down. So that way, if I need to reference the line art layer after I've fucked everything up, I can. But if I don't, but the ideal workflow is to not have to reference it again. And once you have the map in place, once you have this basic pattern of where shadows are, where light is, the rest of it is pretty intuitive. You just decide what needs to be darker or lighter, and blend or sharpen as need be. So for example, this here, this little chunk right here, I want to be sharper because it's casting this shadow. But I want this portion here, so that this section here, to be softer because it's turning away. It's a slow change. And then to make it pop, I grab a lighter value and make it lighter. And by following this sort of linear workflow, I find that it helps you control the information your values contain. Because, quite frankly, if you're struggling making the marks that you want, just like in the last episode we talked about it, then you shouldn't be worrying about values just yet. It's much like when you're in Drawing 1 in a university, you'll work pretty much exclusively with Conte or with charcoal or what have you. And a lot of the times you'll begin by working in line because you can't control the value yet, even if you wanted to. And the computer gives you incredibly precise control over your values, but you don't have the decision making or the muscle control with your stylus to make those values match up to what you need them to. Back to what I'm actually doing here for a moment. I'm just slowly blending in the lines where they need to be, softening the edges where there's a form shadow, and sharpening them where there's a cast shadow. And by doing this, you get the information of what's going on with your form without having to actually, plan anything. As long as you know what you're making, it's as simple as, does this read properly? And there's not too many things you can do. It can be either it can either need to be darker, it can need to be lighter, it can need to be sharper, it can need to be softer. The problem comes when you have to make all of these decisions from phase 1 and you try to render without a plan. But in the case of this picture here, I came in with the simple value map we see on this guy over here. It's this boy. And I've been slowly refining it as I go. And I'm gonna just do another quick pass as I lighten stuff up and darken stuff up. And keep in mind that, because shadow pulls most of the work, everything, let me grab let's actually grab the white. Everything that's not in the area that I'm doing in white right now, I didn't even have to paint. I left it as is, because I was working with dark, and that manages to keep my dark areas in shadow and separate from the light areas with literally no decision making. The only thing you have to decide is what's going on in the light areas, because that's where people look, and how do I transition that into the dark areas. And that's as simple as softening where needed, sharpening where needed, and if you're going for a painterly look, removing the brushwork. And so in this case, I'm darkening the whole thing to try to hide the line work. Did I say brushwork? I meant line work. And next, this here is a decision to be made. This section right here is an important decision to be made. How do I separate this section from this section? And I actually haven't decided yet, but because these overlap, but they are both in shadow. It's not going to have this dark shape here. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take a liberty, and I'm going to actually lighten this as if it were catching some rim lighting or some bounce light. Is this accurate? No. This is a decision being made to help the shape read. Another thing I'm thinking of doing to help with that just a bit is to add a little bit of occlusion to this area, this section. Like you see down here. This mark in this region, I'm actually going to grab white so I can highlight it. This mark, this is an occlusion zone. And much like it sounds, this is an area where something can't get in this case light. So it's the only part of your image in shadow that will be darker than the actual local shadow value. And that is why I do my lines separately and then erase them as needed. Because, for example, the line separating this here is not necessary. This line here is not necessary. So I can just paint it away. Because whatever local color the background is in a proper illustration, it will inherently be different than the object. So as long as you have an area of value for the object and an area of value for the a shape of value for the background, they'll be separate without any actual line being needed. But in this case, this section here and this section here, they're both on the same object, both in shadow, so they will have the same value. And the line that I made marks an occlusion zone, the one section where light can't get to, because not only is it in shadow, but it's also positioned in such a way that would make it difficult for light to bounce in there. And so by using these considerations, you can take your simple value statement from earlier, the plan that this guy has going on, and use it to define the forms. So I'm going to quickly mark in that occlusion shadow, and then blend it out as need be so that it's not too dramatic. And I'm also going to try to separate the this background portion, this back section of my abstract form from the background of the image, so that way it reads. And this here that I'm doing, this is a lazy trick that I like to use. Is it proper? Not really. But for the purposes of a value study, it helps things read in 3D. When you're doing a proper illustration, you need to get a little more creative with it. You should be using background elements and shapes to help make edges pop in a way that makes sense to the story you're trying to tell with your drawing. But in the case of a study where you're simply trying to use values to make an object that looks like it could exist in 3D space, I personally think it's good enough. And so, with that, we have our form. Is it perfect? No. But the actual goals, the actual thinking of it were quite simple. There was no fancy rendering. It wasn't a multi-hour long painting. This was done in, 10-15 minutes, and it gives you practice putting down values to describe forms. And I'm going to do it one more time really quickly on this one over here, on this side, so I can demonstrate it and talk about some other stuff. One of the issues with Paint Tool SAI is that it's not great at handling precision colors, so you get some weird color banding when you go in with a mixer brush. But this roughly reads as a 3D surface. One of the issues that arises is that it just looks like clay because there's no texture. But texture is an entirely different lesson. When you're dealing with texture, that's where things like custom brushes will help, or particular brushwork. But for now, we're just focusing on getting values that read as a surface turning in 3D space. And this gives you an idea of the shape of this object as well as the direction that the lighting is coming from. So I'm going to work on the other one real quick as well. And then I believe we'll be done here. So while I'm working on this one, what I want to talk about is edges. Especially because this one is going to have fewer cast shadows. It's going to be mainly just soft edges. And this falls in the realm of rendering, not in the realm of values, but using edges is fairly simple, but it's mechanically tricky. Getting the transition that you want is difficult. And I'm actually going to jump back to that example from earlier. Where is he? Where, as you can see here, I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to be nitpicky. You can see this weird banding effect that's going on, where you can see the brush strokes. And that's fine if your brush strokes are intentful in telling a story, but in the case of a value study, generally they're not. And generally, when they appear like that, it's because the person doing the study is struggling getting the value transitions they want. And that's why a lot of people recommend working exclusively with hard brushes, so then you don't think about value transitions at all. But I think that's detrimental, because those value transitions help you describe form, and just like Vilpu teaches us, you're trying to learn to describe form, not shape. You want to learn both, but form and shape are two separate sides of art. Form is 3D things being represented, whereas shape is a design principle. Shape is how things look in a 2D space and can be used to good effect. It's also like cinematography, for example. Good camera work relies very heavily on strong use of 2D shapes on the screen to direct the viewer's attention. So if you exclusively focus yourself on shapes, you may find yourself struggling with getting the values that you want. And that's why I recommend using a soft brush in whatever method you need, and you know what, go ahead and use the Photoshop blend brush or whatever blend brush your thing has, but don't use it until you have your map, right? Like don't hit the open road until you know where you're going, so to speak. Whereas working with just the hard brushes is having a map, but then walking the whole distance. It'll take longer, and it probably won't be as fun. You'll get tired. Anyway, that's basically all I have to say about values. As you can see, I'm sort of half-assing this one here. It's not nearly as blended as the other one because I had more stuff to talk about while working on it. But effectively, if you get a value roadmap, if you get a plan for what you want your values to be telling you, the rest of it is pretty simple. And personally, I find that it's easier to come up with that plan when you're working from dark to light, because it automatically separates the areas that are hardest for beginners to separate, which is light and shadow, and keeping the shadows dark enough and the lights light enough. And as long as you pick a value for your shadow and pick a value for your light that's far enough apart, they keep themselves separate with minimal extra input on your part. So it's a really strong tool for improving your values as a beginner. I'm not gonna, I kind of want to clean up some of these edges because they're nasty. But see, everything that's going on now is just sort of autopilot. I think, ooh, that line looks shonky, or that edge looks nasty, and you just go in and touch it up. And you may have to go over it a couple of times to touch it up right, because we're not robots, and you lay down things improperly sometimes. But using good tools makes that easier. Using the blend brush when you need it to get the soft edges that you want. Using the hard brush to clearly separate stuff. The last thing I want to talk about before I finish this out is that I didn't use an eraser at all in either of these. I was only ever adding pigment and using the color picker to add a pigment that works as an eraser. So, because this is all on one layer. So if I wanted to, for example, erase, quote unquote, this light section, I just pick a dark color with the color picker, the little eyedropper, and paint over it. If I want to erase something on the actual subject, I decide which way I want to go and use a color based on that. So for example, I want to erase some of this shadow. That means that I need to counteract it with the light, and that will act as an eraser. And in doing this, it gets you thinking of using your values to tell stories rather than using your brush to lay down colors and your eraser to remove them, you start thinking about using values to change the forms underneath, right? Like for example, if I, instead of erasing the light area or the dark area, I sharpen something, I'm expanding this plane instead of erasing a value. It gets you thinking about using, it gets you thinking about 3D forms rather than just 2D shapes. And you can start associating every value with a plane facing a direction. And once you start doing that, putting down the values that you want will become much easier, because it's as simple as that linear game plan of, is this area in light or shadow? Apply values where appropriate. And the elements of style and the design and the principles like that will come with time. But for now, working with what you've got is probably the safer choice. So, I do hope that was helpful to some of you. If you have any comments or anything that you'd like me to look at in the future, just let me know. I'd be more than happy to. That's a lot of fun for me personally. And with all that out of the way, good luck practicing your values, and I recommend doing some simple abstract shapes and coming up with a map for them yourself rather than doing a study from a picture. Because doing a study from a picture gets you trying to think about what do you see and recreate it rather than what do you know and how to apply it. And they're two separate fields. Anyway, good luck guys, and remember to practice every day.